Good morning. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Beatriz Junco Gonzalez. I am the Corporate Communications and Responsibility Manager at Mercantil Commerce Bank, and it is my privilege to welcome you to the first of the 2013-2014 Leadership Lecture Series here at FIU. We are so honored, again, once again this year, to partner with FIU and the Center for Leadership, the wonderful team, to bring you these very unique lectures to you and to the community. This is a very important part of what we do at Mercantil Commerce Bank, something we believe in dearly in terms of creating better leaders and really being a contributor and a good corporate citizen in terms of where we do business. Today, of course, we are honored to have with us Dr. Martin Seligman, who I know is going to wow you because he was already trying to make me nervous. He said I would be more creative if I became more nervous. So I think he certainly made me more nervous. I don't know if I'm going to be creative, probably not. But it's going to be a wonderful series this year. If you came to one of the lectures last year, that series was wonderful, and this one is going to be as phenomenal. So thank you once again for being here. And as usual, it is my honor and pleasure to always introduce Dr. Maidik, the Executive Director of the Center for Leadership and President Emeritus of FIU. Professor Maidik is the Alva H. Chapman Jr. Eminent Scholar Chair here for Leadership here at Florida International University. And in June of 2009, he was named President Emeritus of Florida International University by the FIU Board of Trustees in recognition of his, which we all know, his leadership, dedication, and transformational accomplishments during the 23 years that he led FIU. I am one of his former students, pretty much, and as always, honored to welcome him and present him. Thank you, Dr. Maidik.
Thank you, Betty, and thank you for your support for our university, and in particular for our center. I want you to know we don't have a precise count, but we think that there are 380, 81, 82, folks here. And this is, you'll be delighted to know, Dr. Seligman, the best attended lecture we have had in the 4-year history of the center. A lot of it has to do with your looks, Marty, so people are coming to... I started to think about how to introduce Dr. Seligman, and what came to mind is an experience I had about 25 years ago in which I introduced Wally Gilbert. Now, he may not be a household name to you, but Wally Gilbert was the 1980 winner of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And also, he was the CEO of Biogen, together with Genentech, one of the top new biotechnology firms. And we asked, he was a professor at Harvard at the time. He split his time between Harvard and Biogen. And we asked for a bio. He asked for a bio to introduce someone. So the bio comes through, and it says, Nobel Prize, Waller, Gilbert, Wally, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, 1980. And I'm saying, darn it, it's already 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I got to introduce this guy tomorrow morning. I need the rest of the bio. So rather than even ask my assistant, I called directly his assistant. I said, send me the rest of the bio. She said, sir, that is the bio. I said, okay. And I learned at that moment, after some extremely lengthy introductions that I've had, that the less eminent the person is, the longer the introduction. Haven't you noticed that? Joined the PTA in 1982, rescued a sick dog in 1983, taught Sunday school for one day in 1995. So taking that story to heart, I'd like to introduce our speaker today with one very simple line. I give you the top expert on happiness in the world.
To turn myself on. Can Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you, Mitch. Honored to be here. Our topic today is nothing less than what do you most want in life? Now, you may think that's a trivial question, but it turns out not to be for psychology and the social sciences. And the reason is that Freud and Schopenhauer, the main influences of modern medical and social science, said the best we could ever do in life, the most we could hope for, was not to be miserable. Best we could ever do is not to suffer. And indeed, the science I come from, and medicine, has built itself around the question of going from -8 to -2 in life. But when you lie in bed at night, you're not thinking how to go from -8 to -2. You're thinking about how to go from +3 to +5 in life. And so I want to talk about the possibility that there's much more to life than not being miserable, and that even if you were terrifically good at cutting misery, asymptotically successful, you get to 0. The question is, what's above 0? So I want to contend that what Freud and Schopenhauer told us was empirically false, morally insidious, and politically a dead end. That's the substance of my next 30 minutes or so. And to do that, I have to begin by talking about what is well-being. And I'll find my speech in here someplace. And outline what I'm going to do today. So I'm going to say the topic of well-being, what free people choose to do, has 5 elements. And my acronym for those elements is PERMA. P is positive emotion. Mitch's introduction about happiness is part of that. But there's a great deal more to positive psychology than smiling and being merry and being cheerful. There are real limits on happiness, subjective well-being. It turns out it's Gaussianly distributed. Half the world right now is not feeling good. And in fact, the evidence is, although I'm going to talk some about how to increase P, basically the most you can do if you're a negative, positively effective person is to live in the upper range of a biological set point about how you feel. But there's more to it, positive psychology and what people choose, than how you feel. The second element, E, is engagement. And engagement is being one with the music, being in flow, when time stops for you. So as I look around, it looks to me that about 70% of you are one with the music right now, completely absorbed in what I'm saying. The other 30% of you are having sexual fantasies, by the way. The third element is R, that people choose good relationships, and I'll talk about that. The fourth element is M, meaning and purpose. We are ineluctably hive creatures. There's a lot more to us than selfish genes. We want to belong to and serve something bigger than we are. It's a major human motivation. And the final element of positive psychology is A, achievement. So I'm going to talk about those. And then the question will be, once we define it, how to measure it. And I'm going to say something far out to you today about measurement. I've spent a lot of my life doing questionnaires in which we ask people how they're feeling. The age of the questionnaire is coming to an end. There's something brand new under the sun about measuring PERMA and measuring well-being that will replace questionnaires. Then I want to talk about the question of, can you build PERMA? Can people have more in life, more happiness, more engagement, more good relationships? And it turns out that's quite a controversial notion. One of the reasons people didn't work on happiness in psychology was a famous study of lottery winners about 40 years ago. 14 winners of the Illinois lottery were followed, and it turned out that for about 3 months after you win the lottery, your life satisfaction goes up, but then in about 6 months it goes back to where it was. And so people said that well-being was like dieting. Important to talk about dieting just a bit. Dieting, as you probably know, is a scam. It's a $50 billion a year scam in the United States. Here's why it's a scam. You can take any diet on the bestseller list and lose 5% of your body weight in about 3 weeks. I did the watermelon diet. I lost 20 pounds in about 3 weeks. I had diarrhea for 3 weeks. But the problem is 90% of people regain all that weight or more in the next 3 to 5 years. So what people thought about happiness is you could boost it by winning the lottery, but then it's going to go back to your usual curmudgeonly state. Now that turns out to be false, and I'm going to talk about the actual building of PERMA. So you can actually have more well-being than you do now, and I'll talk about that. So I'm going to talk, then the bulk of the talk will be, I'll take each of PER, M&A, I'll tell you one piece of science that goes on, and one thing that we've learned about how to build this. And by the way, when I talk about how to build something, this is not casual. So I'm a random assignment, placebo-controlled outcome researcher. And so I did a lot of that with drugs and psychotherapy in my life. But when we started to work on well-being, we asked the same question. That is, there have been about 200 suggestions from the Buddha to Tony Robbins about how you can be happier. And so we actually do random assignment placebo-controlled tests of this. And there are about 12 that seem to work. And I'll tell you a bit about these. I'll tell you one for positive emotion. Then we're going to talk about engagement. And I'll talk a bit about signature strengths and going into flow. Then I'll talk about relationships. How many of you are clinical psychologists? Oh, good. So I have something to say about something new in therapy going on. I'll talk about that. I'll talk about the pursuit of meaning and the difference between having pleasure and doing good. Remarkable, important differences. And then I'll talk about A and the notion of grit, the people who never give up. That'll be the bulk of what I say, but then I'm going to say something about Adam Smith and the invisible hand argument. And this is the question of building PERMA, building positive psychology, is local, not general, and I'll explain that to you. Then I'll talk about positive education. This is being done widely in schools across the world. I just came in yesterday from Monterrey, Mexico, in which 2 universities are creating the first positive psychology entire universities. And then I'll talk about the largest program on positive psychology, and that's the entire U.S. Army. And in the course of that, since this is a lecture on leadership, I'll make at least one comment on the relationship of positive psychology to leadership. And finally, I'll talk about the future. So that's what we'll do over the next 30 minutes or so. For me, to flourish is a dashboard concept. That is, there's no one number that tells you how an airplane is doing. There's a whole bunch of gauges, and depending on your mission, one or more of those gauges may be crucial. So if you're trying to get to Chicago as cheaply as possible, the fuel gauge is crucial. If you're trying to get people there as comfortably as possible, what you want to know about speed and headwinds and the like. Human well-being is like that, more complicated, and it depends on your mission. And as I say, there are 5 elements: positive emotion that people choose, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And depending on your values, Positive psychology is descriptive and not prescriptive. It says if you're someone who values relationships, I'm not going to tell you to go off and value pleasure. The notion of positive psychology is given which of these things you value. Positive psychology attempts to tell you more about if you're a pleasure seeker, what we know about pleasure, what we know about its antagonistic relationship to meaning, what the gender ratios are, how to build it, and what kind of upbringing inhibits it. So positive psychology, from my point of view, basically describes what is prescribed. And these are the 5 elements of it. So what I want to talk about now is, given those 5 elements, can you quantify it? So let's say Florida International University decided that its mission was not only to teach knowledge to students, but to raise their well-being. So the question is, can you measure that? And the usual psychological answer is a pretty good qualified yes. And now the way you do it is by questionnaire. So 3 years ago, David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, decided, 1, that he would measure the well-being of Britain, and 2, and most importantly, he would hold himself accountable for the success or failure of public policy by increases in well-being. A radical political statement, and I'll return to it at the end of my talk. So I'm on Mr. Cameron's statistical committee, and what we do is we make 300,000 phone calls every 3 months to a random sample of people in Britain, and we ask them, how happy are you? Were you anxious yesterday? Is what you do in life worthwhile? And we quantify that, and that's very nice, and that's what psychologists have been doing for a long time, and these questionnaires are pretty good. I'm an inveterate measurer, but there's something new under the sun, and it's big data and the social media. So about 4 years ago, I gave the keynote address at Google for their Zeitgeist thing, and I got together with the Google Earth people, and I said, I think we could measure the well-being of the whole planet in real time, and that if you're Mr. Cameron and you want to know if I build a park in Manchester, to what extent does this increase engagement or happiness? And I think we can measure that free in real time, and that big data was the key. So what we started to do with Google, and we now do it with Twitter and Facebook, is we comb through literally hundreds of millions of tweets and Facebook statuses for the following. So it turns out PERMA, just take the P, happiness part, has a lexicon, and it turns out there are roughly 45,000 words in English that are PERMA and anti-PERMA words. So what we now do is we comb through, in place and time, looking for those 45,000 words, and we construct measures, unobtrusive, non-reactive, of well-being by how much you're using the PERMA words versus the anti-PERMA words. And this is just a sample of the sort of thing we do about the measurement of personality. So it's analogous. So as you know, psychologists have been measuring neuroticism for a long time and emotional stability for a long time. And there are questionnaires about this. So we had 70,000 people take the neuroticism stability kind of questionnaire. But then we also got all their email, and with their permission, of course. And we asked the question, what's the relationship between what they say on email and the questionnaire? Now, this is a data-full slide. The bigger the word, the more it correlates with the phenomenon. So highly neurotic people say, I'm sick of a lot, anymore, depressed, why? And emotionally stable people say success, basketball, beautiful day, and the like. So it turns out for well-being, you can, if FIU had decided to make this the happiest university in the world, the way you'd measure it essentially would be to get all of the students' email, de-identified anonymously, of course, and quantify this kind of thing. And it predicts that the use of the PERMA would go upwards and the anti-PERMA words would go down. Now, here's the sort of thing we do with these measures. So I spend a lot of my time on physical illness, and this is a cardiovascular death. So what we did was there are 1,400 counties in the United States and 80 million tweets, which were identified county by county. And we looked at the PERMA and anti-PERMA words, and we correlated the PERMA and anti-PERMA words with cardiovascular death in that county. And what this tells you is they're almost identical. That the counties in which there's a high amount of hate, fuck, depressed, these are the counties with high cardiovascular, and the counties with low cardiovascular, basketball, friends, love, etc. So the message of this part is that I think the age of the questionnaire is coming to an end, and that psychologists, statisticians will take advantage of the social media and basically measure well-being and plenty of other things just by using de-identified social media. So PERMA is measurable. It also turns out that the lottery study was wrong. It's teachable. You can learn it. And let me go through some of this. I'm going to do it for individuals, and then I'm going to do it for schools and the entire U.S. Army. So let's take these things one at a time. So the first one is P, positive emotion, happiness, joy, rapture, warmth, comfort. And ask, can this be increased? And so let me tell you about how we measure building PERMA. So I'm a depressive and a pessimist. I actually believe only a depressive can do good science on depression. I take my own medicine. So when someone suggests an intervention, I try it on myself. If it works on me, I give it to my wife and 7 children. If it works on them, I give it to my graduate students, and we do clinical outcome studies. And then if it works in the clinic, we put it up on the web. So I have a website. It's free. It's called AuthenticHappiness.org. About 3.25 million people have registered on it. 2,000 new people register every day. And every so often I put up exercises. If you go to exercises, it says something like the following. Dr. Seligman would like to find out what really works in raising well-being and what's a placebo. So if you're willing to do this, you're going to get an exercise, and you won't know whether or not it's a placebo. And then you'll do it for a week, and then we're going to bug you for 6 months to find out what its effects are. So so when I talk about things that work, they've been through that whole chain of logic. So here's an exercise for you that works. Every night for the next week, before you go to sleep, write down 3 things that went well today. They don't have to be great things. It could be a pretty sunset, a flower you saw, a good conversation. I'm going to write down Betty trying to make you nervous as my thing tonight. I still do it almost 15 years later. Why it went well. And when you measure people with this exercise 6 months later, compared to controls, placebos, their life satisfaction is up and their depression is down. And there's something more to say about it. So if I assign you a positive psychology exercise that works, it's not only that it increases PERMA, but they're fun to do. Now, the clinical psychologists know the following. The dirty little secret of therapy and of drugs for psychiatric disorders is that they melt. And in fact, The way we measure the effectiveness of a psychotherapy is how long after therapy ends does it stay before it melts to zero. And that's because, like dieting, it's just no fun to keep turning down chocolate mousse, and you stop turning it down after a while. And the same is true of the skills of psychotherapy. The nice thing about the positive exercises is they're addicting. So it turns out, 15 years ago I started doing the 3 good things, and I sleep better now. I don't go to sleep thinking about my fight with my dean. Rather, I think about where I'm going to put the tulip bulbs that I just got tomorrow, and the like. So importantly, these are self-maintaining. These are easy exercises, and they're self-maintaining. Second concept, engagement, when time stops for you. Now, if we were doing an overnight workshop, I would do this full-blown with you, but I'm going to do half of it with you now. So close your eyes. Think of something that you have to do at work at least once a week that you really don't like doing. Okay, open your eyes. Almost all of you will have thought of something. Now, if we had done this full-blown, I first would have had you go to my website and take the signature strengths test. That tells you what your 5 highest strengths are. Then your assignment would be things like social intelligence, humor, gratitude are the sorts of strengths we measure. Then your assignment would be next week, do this thing you don't like doing using your highest strength. Now let me put some flesh on that. So one of my students would study in the library at Penn till midnight, and then he had to walk to 52nd and Spruce, about 20 blocks through the most dangerous part of Philadelphia at midnight. This was the worst time of day for him. So he took the signature strengths test, and his highest strength was humor and playfulness. So his job was to recraft the walk using humor and playfulness. So what would you do? So he did the following. He bought a stopwatch and a pair of rollerblades, and he declared it an Olympic event and timed himself every night to get home in the shortest time to create a personal best, and when he had asymptoted, he would create a new, more difficult route to go through, and this became the highlight of his day. So what we find when we do this systematically is 6 months later, when you give this to people in corporations, in school, on average, there's statistically higher life satisfaction and lower depression. When we look at character strengths, by the way, there are a couple of more things I want to say about this literature. I'm very interested in post-traumatic growth. And when I talk about Army in about 15 minutes and its relationship to post-traumatic stress disorder, I'll say a little bit more. We ask people about the worst things that can happen to you in life. And we measure who, after those things, grows and who deteriorates. And the short answer is that the usual response to awful events like death of a child, combat, is actually that people grow, that they're stronger a year later than they were before. And what we find is that these 5 character traits are the mediators of growth after trauma: religiousness, gratitude, kindness, hope, and bravery. Another thing we do in corporations is we ask, what's the relationship of the different signature strengths? Oh, this is based on hundreds of thousands of people. This is a huge data set. We ask, what is the relationship of the 24 character strengths to the profession you're in? Now, this actually is a much more complicated slide than it looks like. If 2 strengths are close together, it means if you have one, you probably have the other. This is a correlative two-dimensional matrix. So if you have gratitude, then you probably have the capacity to love and be loved. and you probably don't have creativity and love of learning. So when they're far apart, they're anti-correlated. So we asked the question for these 4 professions, what are the signature strengths of people in them? So it turns out if you're a teacher, you have kindness, gratitude, and love, but you don't have creativity and bravery. If you're a CEO, you have zest and hope, but you don't have honesty and prudence. If you're a professor, you're very good at creativity and bravery, but you don't have kindness and forgiveness. And then, so that's just for large numbers of people in these professions. We then ask, how about the great ones? What do they have? And so for teaching, it turns out it's very interesting. The great teachers, the 2 strengths they have are humor and zest. And that's important because those things are teachable. So in the same way that we teach math teachers mathematics, we can teach humor and zest. So that's the kind of thing we do with signature strengths. Relationships. How many of you are marriage or sex counselors? Okay, well, only a couple of you. So as they know, and I've taught this for a long time, this is the worst kind of therapy. People are lying to you, they're lying to each other, and the outcome statistics are miserable. Now, here's what I used to, when I taught marriage and sex, here's what I used to teach, is what the marriage counseling books tell us to do. Teach people how to fight better. Okay, you don't really want people to have the same damn fight every day in a different guise. So basically what we're taught to do in normal marital therapy is to take insufferable marriages and make them barely tolerable. But that's not a positive psychology endeavor. And about 10 years ago, some very inventive marriage counselors in California discovered celebration, active constructive responding, and then researched it. Now, this is a question when something good happens, when your spouse comes home with something, a victory, what do you say to her? Okay? Well, it turns out there's a 2-by-2 table of what people say. Until I read this literature, I was in passive constructive, which is, congratulations, dear, you deserve it. That was a good speech, Betty. Okay? That has no effect at all. I work with drill sergeants. Drill sergeants do active destructive. So your spouse comes home and she's been promoted at work. And a drill sergeant will say to his spouse or her spouse, by the way, 18% of drill sergeants in the Army are female now, you know what tax bracket that's going to put us into? That's active destructive. That has negative effects. Very common is passive destructive, which is what's for dinner. Now, the only thing that works, and it works very well, and it's hard, it doesn't come naturally, is active constructive. So active constructive begins with, you know, I've been reading your papers, what you've written at work, and that last report you wrote on the pension plan, the best document, financial document that I've read in my 25 years in business. Now, would you relive the experience with me? Exactly what did your boss say to you when he said you were promoted? And where were you? And she describes all that. Now, what do you think the real reasons, your highest strengths were that got you promoted? And you draw this out of her. People are usually very modest, but you can draw them out. And how do you think you could use those strengths more at church or with the kids? Let's go open a bottle of great champagne. And it turns out when you teach this to couples, love, sexuality, a commitment to marriage goes up and divorce goes down. So that's active constructive responding. Meaning, belonging to and serving something larger than you are. Human beings have evolved to do this. I'm often asked, I deal with depressed people a lot, what one single thing, if you're in the 15% of depressed Miami people, right now, what's the one single thing you can do that'll give you at least a short-term break from depression? It turns out it's to go out and help another person. I'm not preaching about this, just empirically, it turns out we're wired to help others, and our hedonic system is wired to it. So I have my students do exercises on this. I have them do something fun or do something philanthropic, and then to report back. So when I do this, something quite remarkable happens when people report this, and life-changing for some people. When you do something fun, like hang out with your friends or go to the movies or masturbate, it turns out it's a square wave offset, that when it's over, it's over. But when you do something philanthropic, it lasts. So one of my students was in the middle of her midterm week, her 10-year-old nephew called her on the phone and wanted to be tutored in fractions. So she spent 2 hours on the phone tutoring him in fractions. And she said, after that, the whole day went better for me. Well, I was mellow. I could listen to people. People liked me more. And then one of my business students said, you know, Dr. Seligman, I'm at Wharton because I want to make a lot of money. And the reason I want to make a lot of money is money brings security, and it brings control, and it brings happiness. But I was astonished to find out that I was happier helping another person than I was shopping. And that's an important insight. It turns out we're wired that way. So that's meaning, accomplishment, grit. One of my colleagues, Angela Duckworth, spends a lot of her time comparing talent to self-discipline. And so we do longitudinal studies in school in which we predict things like winners of the spelling bee, getting into a good college, grade point average. We measure IQ, we measure grit and self-discipline, and basically persistent self-discipline and grit accounts for about twice the variance of IQ. And so that's the trait we really want to nurture here. So that's what goes on in PERMA. So I've told you about the kind of exercises we do. There are about a dozen that work. But the most important thing that I believe is true about PERMA and the exercises is that the exercises are pretty much irrelevant to you. So Nancy, let's say you decide that your role as Mitch's wife is to increase his PERMA. That's the goal in your marriage. And you're going to measure it. You're going to measure Mitch's PERMA once a week. Turns out you're not going to have him go make gratitude visits and write down 3 You know the kind of thing that increases PERMA in Mitch. That is, it's local. And so the general algorithm here is if you run a corporation or a school and you decide, the data is pretty good on this, that high PERMA is related to high productivity, here's what you should do in this formulation. You should say, I value PERMA, and we're going to measure it before, during, and after. And then you should say to the managers, I don't know how you increase PERMA, but I'm going to hold you accountable for the increase in PERMA. And what you'll find is that people will find ways of increasing happiness, engagement, relationships, and meaning on the job. So the Adam Smith invisible hand argument here holds well, and it's important because I'm going to talk a little bit about whole communities and nations. And I don't think things like 3 good things are the answer. I think the answer is the measurement of well-being and then holding people accountable for increasing it in work, in school, and with their spouses. Okay, so what I've said so far is that at the individual level, we've learned quite a lot about PERMA and how to build it, what impedes it. And now what I want to finish with is, can you do this in large groups? This is a leadership question for me. So we now go into schools. There are several hundred schools around the world that now teach positive psychology as part of their curriculum. This is a study that we did with the Department of Education in which we took 9th grade literature, and there, by the way, there's an epidemic of depression in young people. The 9th grade canon, as you can remember, is things like Death of a Salesman, Romeo and Juliet, Scarlet Letter, Lord of the Flies, Macbeth. So it's one tragedy after another. We didn't go after the canon, we let the canon stand. But in 4 of the classrooms, this was all randomized well, when you read Lord of the Flies, you got 80 minutes on Friday about what's known about kindness. And then you had an exercise. Next Wednesday, you had to go and do 3 kind acts. So for 24 weeks, each of the strengths PERMA was taught, and it was merged with literature. And then we followed the students, and the 4 classes was just literature as usual. And then we followed them for the next 2 years, and we found that the kids who had been through literature with positive psychology changed. And this, let's see, this one is teachers who don't know which students have been through what, measure social skills and cooperation. And you find that the kids who have been through positive psychology with literature in the 9th grade increase more than the kids who have not. Importantly, their grades go up as well. They write better. No difference in the honors group. That's grade inflation. Everyone gets an A. But for normal kids, they write better and they learn more. We'd done quite a bit of this, and then I had a life-changing experience about 5 years ago, and probably the most important thing that's happened in positive psychology. George Casey, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army, called me to the Pentagon for a meeting of the General Staff. And he said, suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, panic, depression, divorce, substance abuse. What does positive psychology say about that, Dr. Seligman? And so I said, sir, the reaction of human beings to awful events is bell-shaped. And you just described what's on the left-hand side of the bell. People who have their lives ruined by combat or divorce or death of a child or even by a lawsuit. But importantly, in all this publicity about post-traumatic stress disorder, what's forgotten is that the great middle of the bell are people who are resilient. Resilience is normal, and what resilience means operationally is you go through a hard time in combat, but 3 months later, by our physical and psychological measures, you're back where you were. And most importantly, on the right-hand side of the bell is post-traumatic growth, which is more common than post-traumatic stress disorder. And what that means, these are the people who often go through a terrible time in combat, but a year later, by our physical and psychological measures, they're stronger than they were to begin with. So my suggestion, General, is to move everything to the right, to move the whole Army distribution toward post-traumatic growth. Whereupon George did 2 things, which I'll remember the rest of my life. First thing he said, I intend to create an Army that is just as psychologically fit as physically fit, and he allocated $145 million to doing this. And the second thing he said, and unlike, Mitch, what you and I do, in which we try to coax people into doing what we think, George orders them to do what he thinks should be done. And the second thing he said, you know, Dr. Seligman, we've been reading your work on schools, and we see that you go into schools and you teach teachers the skills of positive psychology. And then you measure depression, anxiety, well-being in the students. Well, that's the Army model. We've got 40,000 teachers in the Army. I said, really? He said, yeah, the drill sergeants. So your job, Dr. Seligman, will be to train all the drill sergeants in resilience and positive psychology, and they will train the entire 1.1 million person Army, and we will measure the results in the soldiers. And so from that day on, 180 drill sergeants come to the University of Pennsylvania. once a month. My faculty gives them an 8-day course, which was a long version of what we're doing today, with exercises. The drill sergeants learn to do it in their own lives, and then how to teach it. And then we just graduated our 18,000th drill sergeant, and the Army has been measuring this. And here's the sort of thing they find. So as people go through deployment, Iraq and Afghanistan, if you've had training in positive psychology, you get better at coping, at flexibility and the like. If you haven't, you get worse during deployment. The Army has concluded that this is effective, and they recently published hard data on this. So people who have been through positive psychology, the soldiers have 50% lower substance abuse, and if you combine the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety, there's 12 to 13% lower in soldiers who have been through this. This brings me to my conclusion. What I've said so far is that well-being is a reasonable life goal. It's not just the relief of suffering and not to be miserable. There are actually ways to be happier, and they're not the same as cutting misery and suffering. There are skills of PERMA, and I said it could be measured, and I talked about ways of doing it, and that it's done in large-scale groups now. So as you think about your own life, your community, about our nation, let's ask the question, if we decided that PERMA was a goal in our life, or for FIU, or for Florida, or for the United States, and indeed there are whole nations thinking about this, what would likely happen? Well, we don't know, because no one's ever done it on a large scale, but you may know that Bhutan, as an entire country, is interested in this. And very interestingly, I work with China now. President Xi, the new president of China, has said he has 4 goals for China. The 4th one is well-being. And given a very Hobbesian Politburo, for me, the notion that China and the United States could actually agree on a planetary goal of well-being forms a basis for trust, and I hope things will move in that direction. So if you decided to measure PERMA and to build it in your corporation, your community, and your marriage, we're certain you'd get more PERMA, that we know. There are quite a large number of, quite a couple of score studies now on depression and anxiety. Probably would be less depression and anxiety, probably better relationships, and very importantly, and I haven't had time to talk about this today, more success in life. So it turns out that several of us try to measure things like how much money you earn and how you do in corporations as a function of PERMA. Now we know that when you're successful, that makes you happier. We're interested in the other question. If you have high PERMA, what is your chances of success? And the answer to that, in one study we did, we took the upper 10% of University of Illinois graduates on PERMA when they were 20 years old, and we measured their grade point average and the wealth of their family. And then we looked 15 years later at how much money they were earning. So the high PERMA kids, co-varying out co-varying out grade point average and income, 15 years later earning $15,000 more on average than the rest of their peers. So there's a fair amount of data suggesting that PERMA promotes success. And as I mentioned but didn't talk about it, a lot of my work these days is about heart disease and infectious illness. And there's good reason to believe that high PERMA buffers against cardiovascular disease and probably against infectious illness. So I want to conclude. The way I want to conclude is by saying repeating something that Friedrich Nietzsche said about 140 years ago. Nietzsche was talking about human development and the great ages of human development. And he said there are three great ages of history. The first age he calls the camel. Camel, and this is most of human history, just sits there and moans. Then he says the second great age, which for him starts in 1776, is the age which he called the lion. This is the age in which people in politics say no. The camel says no to poverty, no to racism, no to plague, no to Sharia, no to tyranny. And the politics of saying no has worked. That is, I think you have to be blinded by ideology not to realize that almost everything you care about is better now than it was 100 years ago. The best book, by the way, last year on this is Steve Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature, which basically shows this enormous decrease in violence over the last 3,000 years. If you lived in London 500 years ago, the probability of your dying a violent death was something like 1 in 25. Now the probability of your dying a violent death is about 1 in 10,000. And that's just a typical statistic. So I think almost everything we cared about has gotten, all the things we want to say no to have gotten better. And then Nietzsche says, well, imagine we were successful at this. Imagine we got rid of all the ills, all the things we wanted to say no about. That would take us to zero. What is it that every human being can say yes to? What is it that every parent wants for their children? What is it that every religion, every politics wants for the human future? And that's what I think we've talked about today. So I believe that every human being, every culture wants more happiness, more positive emotion. I believe we all want more engagement in work with the people we love in our leisure. I believe everyone wants better human relationships, that everyone can affirm and say yes to more meaning and purpose in life, that everyone can say yes to more accomplishment. I believe that the world is turning from being a vale of tears to another politics. And it's the politics of flourishing. It's the politics in which we say, you know, Schopenhauer and Freud, we really do want to relieve suffering, but there's more to human life than that. Human life can be about flourishing, that we can affirm the possibility that the next generation of people on this planet will have more PERMA. Thank you.
Give you some instructions on the Q&A. Okay? Let me tell you how we will proceed from here. I'm sure that this stimulating talk has a number of you with questions. Now, the way we're going to do the question and answer is there are some microphones available, and I will tell you this. I often speak here and at other universities, and my compensation is how tough the questions are, because tough and good questions get you thinking. And if you think, you'll go beyond where you are. So let's get a lot of questions, you know, for Dr. Seligman. Him being a psychologist, he is not going to take the questions from up here. He's going to go right, you know, in your face and take the questions, you know, down, you know, with the audience. So just begin the question and answer. We'll do that for about 15 or 20 minutes. Then I have a couple of thank yous, and the program will be over.
Well, first of all, thank you for your incredible talk. Since I see a lot of students in the audience here today, I was wondering what advice you would give to those of us that are looking to make a mark in the world of positive psychology.
What advice I'd give to
younger students or those of us that are just getting started and want to make a mark in positive psychology?
Positive psychology is a new, wide-open field. It's growing very rapidly, and if you, on the academic side, there are just all sorts of questions that we don't know the answer to. So, for example, what is the relationship between political leanings and PERMA? No one knows the answer to that. So on the academic side, it's just rich with research and quite a lot of it going on. More importantly, in your own life and on the practitioner side, I've taught for 50 years. I've taught everything in psychology except for statistics, I think. And I taught abnormal psychology for 25 years. And I almost never heard the word life-changing. But with positive psychology, I often hear the word life-changing when I teach it. And it's because there are just so many. I mean, the reason abnormal psychology is essentially an experiential failure is you can't assign people to go out and binge drink for a weekend or to become schizophrenic. But you can assign people to make gratitude visits, to increase the PERMA of their girlfriend, to teach PERMA to kids and the like. So on the practitioner side of life, for young people interested in positive psychology, there's lots of academic stuff to do, but this just applies directly to everyone's lives.
What we know about just all of the loss and suffering that seems to be part of just natural human existence, in part because of the transient nature of things, and how you reconcile that with some of your own studies and theories, since it does seem that suffering and misery seems to be part and parcel of being a human being as well.
Yeah, so what's the relationship between suffering and misery, which seems to be part and parcel of the human condition, and positive psychology? Well, I spent the first 35 years of my life working on misery. So learned helplessness, depression, suicide, and the like. Psychology, as usual, has made some inroads into misery. But in some ways, I have to say, what we've learned about therapy and drugs and misery is disappointing. I call it the 65% barrier. So if you I wrote a book about 20 years ago called What You Can Change and What You Can't. And it was a guide Michelin to every drug and psychotherapy for every disorder. And basically I concluded that we're at a 65% barrier, that for depression, by and large, if you take drugs or have psychotherapy, about 65% relief with about 40% placebo, so not much. And so part of the question is, why? And I think there are two answers to why that are both related. One is related to positive psychology, and one is my view of misery generally. I think misery is inevitable. This is the nature of the world we live in, of striving, of disappointment, and the like. And it's particularly poignant in anxiety and depression. Now, the most important discoveries in the field of anxiety and depression of my lifetime are that these are highly genetic, that these are heritable disorders, and in fact, if you deal with a depressed patient, the best you can do is teach them some of the tricks for arguing against the voices that they hear, but they're always going to hear those voices. So when you wake up at 4 in the morning and everything looks grim, this is the way depression is all the time. You can teach people to argue against that. But the honest answer for therapy is that you should tell people you can bring some relief, but you're going to wake up a lot of the time for the rest of your life depressed. But that doesn't mean that you can't lead a rich life. Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill were both profound unipolar depressives. They functioned beautifully in spite of their depression. Sniper training, I'm not about to endorse it, but this is how sniper training is done. If you're a sniper, it takes about 24 hours to get into position, and about 36 hours before you get your shot off. So in fact, when you shoot, you're dead tired. And the question is, how should you train a sniper? And if you gave snipers to psychotherapists or psychiatrists, there are tricks about waking people up, and there are drugs that keep you awake and a lot. That's not how you train snipers. You keep them up for 3 days, and you have them practice shooting when they're dead tired. That is, they live with it. They function under the conditions that are most likely to prevail. So that's the first thing I wanted to say about misery. The second thing is the relationship of positive psychology to misery. Now, our usual way of handling misery and suffering is to try to confront it head on. But it turns out PERMA is a buffer against misery and suffering. That is, building PERMA antagonizes misery and suffering. So just two bits of data about that. I work on chronic pain, people who are in pain for much of their lives. So we take undergraduates and we take their shoes off and we have them put their feet in ice water. And we say, take your foot out as soon as the pain becomes unbearable. And the average undergraduate, about 80 seconds of the foot in ice water before you take the foot out. But if you give them a video game to play, they keep their feet in ice water for 4 minutes. I'm a serious bridge player. Unfortunately, the average age of bridge players in the United States now is about 75. So when I play bridge, I'm playing bridge with people who are arthritic, in pain, cancer, and the like. They're not in pain when they play bridge. They're in pain between sessions. So the second thing I want to say is that there's an inevitability to misery. We can do a little bit about it. We're not great at it. But positive psychology and PERMA is an end run around misery as well.
My question is, there's two main principles of flow versus grit. And I look at, in terms of choosing a career in your profession, what I struggle with personally is, do I move in the direction of working in a profession that my natural skill sets are, my natural strengths are, or what I'm working on now is how do I apply grit in a situation where maybe it's not playing to my strengths, but I'm working to uncover something that maybe I didn't see before. And I'd just like to, see what your recommendation in the direction of which to lead.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So I've been working lately on literally vocation, where vocation doesn't mean choosing a job. Vocation is being called by the future. It's a religious term. In fact, I just 2 weeks ago in Canterbury gathered my theological friends and my psychological naturalist friends to talk about being called by the future. And one very useful thing was said, and it's not mine, but I pass it on, about choosing what to do in life. A secular way of looking at vocation is the crucial juncture at which what you're best at meets the needs of the world. So for me, if you can find that juncture, what strengths, what talents you have, and where they meet what the world needs, that I think, if you're fortunate, is being called.
I ask you, if I'm not currently in that, what do you recommend to get to that?
Well, one good way to start is go to AuthenticHappiness.org and take the signature strengths test. So that will tell you kindness, social intelligence, etc., what your highest strengths are, and try to use those more in your studies and in work. So that'll tell you half of the equation, and then I think political, religious, family questions are the needs of the world questions, and I don't have a way of advising you about that.
I want to thank you for this presentation. It's really an honor to hear you speak. And I'm a professor here at FIU. I teach international and intercultural education. And last night I had a seminar class, and we did a role play on the Syrian refugee situation and crisis. And I had students in my class enact different personalities, so a child, a parent, an aid worker, a government official, et cetera. And we were all just really struck by the complexity of that scenario and the trauma of those refugees. And there's trauma all over the world in what we see today. So what I'm struck by is that this kind of psychological model seems to work from an individual, and then what you're doing is you're kind of looking at how that might apply to societies, nations, or even globally, internationally. So my question is, and when I think about well-being, I also think about things like human rights, human capabilities, and kind of that framework for well-being. So my question is, are there some kind of basic preconditions that are necessary for individuals or societies to benefit from PERMA?
Right.
And so something like absence of abject poverty, reduction of global threats, freedom from enslavement, that kind of thing. And then basically, you know, how could this be applied? Like, you've trained those Army instructors. Could you also train aid workers and doing that in those camps or that kind of thing? What are the applications when you take those things into account?
Good. There are several questions involved in that. So first, what about the preconditions of PERMA? And so various groups are interested in asking preconditions of PERMA. Freedom seems to be one. So if you, the way these data emerge is you look at life satisfaction in 200 nations as a function of different variables. So Zimbabwe, for example, is at the bottom, and the nations that are at the top are all democracies. So that's important. Poverty is really bad for PERMA, and the way you track that is you can look at there's a large number of studies of life satisfaction by income. And you can do this either by nation or by individual income. And the data always look like this, that they're curvilinear. That tells you that below the safety net, increases in income give you linear increases in life satisfaction. But above the safety net, for all of you, if you're making $100,000 a year in the United States, and you're thinking about giving up 4 weekends next year to make $120,000, and what you care about is life satisfaction, you shouldn't do it. It turns out if you spend those 4 weekends with family and friends, that will bring more than the extra $20,000 will. That's what the curvilinear tells you about. But I guess the final thing I want to say about it is that Maslow was wrong about the pyramid of human needs. And so Maslow basically said that if you wanted to get to flourishing, he called it self-actualization, then you had to not be hungry, you had to have self-esteem, you had to have love, you had to be successful at work and the like. I think that's not only dehumanizing, but it's empirically false as well. So I work with suicidal people. I worked on the Rwandan genocide. And the notion that when people are miserable and down at the bottom of Maslowian hierarchies, that they don't care about meaning and is just wrong. So suicidal people, they're not just trying to get out of suffering. They care enormously about the future of their family and the future of the world. So this notion of hierarchical motivation doesn't work, which is to say, positive psychology is everyone's birthright, and we should work on that as we're working on the relief of misery.
I'd like to thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was an honor to hear. My question is kind of related to people like me. So I find that graduate students and especially PhD students are some of the most miserable, depressed, and, and pessimistic people, most pessimistic people of the world. So given that you are doing this at organizational levels like school and nations even, do you think that universities and colleges should have something like something routine that every student should go through some positive psychology exercises rather than waiting for someone to get so miserable that he has to go through to a counselor or a psychiatrist? So,
Well, I'm not part of the happiness police, but I am an educator, and my view of education is that it's not just about knowledge, and this is my view from kindergarten through postdoctoral fellows. It's about the combination of knowledge and building well-being. So I'm very interested in what I call positive education at every level, from kindergarten to through graduate school, in which it's our responsibility as faculty and your responsibility as students not just to know things, but to integrate what you know with your own PERMA and the PERMA of the world. I don't have a way of doing that, but that's the goal of positive education. And your observation about graduate students is absolutely right, but it's not true of my graduate students, by the way. I teach something called MAP, which is Masters of Applied Positive Psychology. I have 350 graduates over the last 9 years. And that is this combination of knowledge, literacy, writing about it, but applying it in your own life as well. This is the highest morale group of graduate students, students I've ever come across.
My name is Terry Murphy, and I work with public sector organizations here in Miami-Dade County, and I'm curious, you mentioned that the British government and the U.S. Army has reached out to you to get some direction on your PERMA program, and I'm curious, the public sector, since the Great Recession here in Florida, certainly has been taking a beating by a lot of our elected leaders, and leadership in general has been demonizing a lot of the public sector workforce. And I'm curious if in the United States you found elected leaders reaching out to you to figure out how to improve morale and lift up the public sector workforce. If there's any mayors or governors that have reached out to you as an advisor.
Yeah, now, no one's really done it, but I should say the British Civil Service is interested in it and starting to do it. I was at number 10 a couple of weeks ago talking about this. So as far as I know, no one has done a program of the head of public services saying, you know, we not only value your social work, but we value your PERMA. And we're going to measure your PERMA. We're going to measure it in your clients as well. And we're going to hold you accountable for increasing your own PERMA and for increasing the PERMA of your clients. That invisible hand operation, I think, it's free, and I think it would have important effects. And I think this is a sector like our defense forces in which productivity, how well you do, is intimately related to having high well-being.
Thank you.
Because we have a very tight schedule and Dr. Seligman has a plane later on in the afternoon, we're have to stop here. But before I thank Dr. Seligman, let me thank Banco Mercantil and Betty Junco. If it weren't for their support, we would not have been able to bring Dr. Seligman here. So Betty, thank you very much for your support. Thank you. I also want to thank all of you. You're record breakers. I don't know if the record breaker is Dr. Seligman or you're the record breakers, but this is our record. Please continue to come. We have the other, half, October 22nd at 2 p.m. We have the president of Jackson Health Systems. He works on the other side. If you're very sick, the hospital will try to bring you to neutral so that you can practice some of the things that Dr. Seligman has talked about today. So he works on making the sick, the infirm, the unhealthy, the depressed, and pull them up. And then we can have the benefit. So if you want both halves, come and listen, to Carlos Migoya. And I'd like to I think we have a very good center. We have terrific faculty. We have Nathan Heller, Fred Walumba, Hokpen Singh here, but there's something at the center better than the faculty, and that's the staff. Would the staff that put together this event please rise and be recognized? Christine, other guys. Thank you. If there are any mistakes, they're mine. They don't make mistakes. And finally, what an honor, what a treat, I think, for all of us to have Dr. Marty Seligman here with us. I'll tell you just a little story that tells you how special this is. I once asked Armando Codina, who is chairman of our board of trustees, I said, Armando, he's very difficult to get to go anywhere. I said, we have the smartest man in the world coming over for dinner at the presidential home this week, and I'd like you to join us. First he asked, how do you know he's the smartest man in the world? I said, well, he told me, and since he is the smartest man in the world, he's the only one that can, realize that all the rest are less intelligent. He once told me, it's Mary Gell-Mann, who should have won 2 Nobel Prizes, but he only won 1, and Mary said to me, if I've seen far, it's because I've been surrounded by midgets. He was a very modest man, but I told Armando, would you come and join us? He says, you know what? I'm going to come and be there. But let me tell you something. If you had the stupidest man in the world, I would come too. And that relates to what I was saying before. We have today here in our midst, within us, the preeminent authority in the world in the field of well-being. And I, for one, I am honored to have him here and to have lunch with him in a little while. Thank you, Marty, for being with us.